Welcome to the Condemned and Happy podcast, a podcast for those grappling with religious trauma and those who care for them. My name is Kim, and I'm a pastor in the ELCA, the more progressive branch of the Lutheran Church. Joining me today is Lyn Smith Gregory, whose great-great-uncle was Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church. Lyn's blogspot is lynsmithgregory.com, and she is the author of the book We Were the Smiths, Escaping the Shadow of Joseph Smith's Mormon Legacy. And I think you are soon to publish a follow-up to this memoir. Am I correct?
No, it's the original memoir
Oh,
that's
that's
on
the original.
to
Okay.
publication right now. We're looking
Okay.
to find a home, and we've got a very positive response from about 8 different publishers.
Awesome. So I hope that someone picks it up quickly because I'd love to read it.
Thank you. Me too.
So welcome to the podcast, Lyn, and let me give you a little bit of my own background. I grew up in Oregon. I now live in Pennsylvania. And one of the things I found about being on the East Coast is not many people on the East Coast are as familiar with Mormons as people who are on the Pacific Northwest, particularly Utah, Washington State. There were more, but Oregon felt like everyone in my classroom was Mormon. I mean, there were a ton of kids growing up. My small town, the Mormons were the biggest group. And somewhere around age 10, I think my best friend told me that she would never leave the Mormon faith. She mentioned something that if she left the faith, her dad told her she would not be welcome in their house again. Is this something you experienced as well?
Thankfully, not that
Okay.
overt. I wasn't disowned and kicked out of the house, but my sister was.
Wow.
Yeah.
Are you comfortable talking about that, or is that a
Yeah.
tangent we should go ahead?
No, we can talk about that because it really plays into my decision to not go down the path my sister was headed down, which was
Okay.
rebelling against the church and against my parents. When I saw that she could be kicked out of the house and basically, as my father put it, wash my hands of her, that one bad apple isn't going to spoil the whole barrel, meaning she was contaminating the rest of the family.
Oh,
And she
geez.
and I were really close. So it was devastating to me to realize that this could happen and that there were limits to my parents' love. That was devastating.
Yeah, I can believe it. For our listeners who are not familiar with Mormonism, can you describe how the church community functions? For example, I went once when I was in elementary school, to the church. I think I had a sleepover, and then we all were dragged to church with the family that had us over. And I was shocked because we were in a Sunday school room, and all of the women referred to each other first as sister and then by their first name. And I grew up in a Lutheran church, and none of us ever called that. You referred to the adults as Mr. or Mrs. You didn't refer to them as sister. You didn't hear people saying to the men, calling each other brother.
Right. And that is the preferred form of address in the Mormon church. Sister and brother Joe. And I think it speaks to the kind of tightly built community that Mormons foster. This is an insular religion in the sense that they really keep you very, very busy and associating with only other Mormons.
Yeah.
If you're not proselytizing, I'm not surprised that they dragged all of you kids to church, because Mormons, they're famous for their missionary program,
Yep.
but they consider In fact, it was a slogan in the Mormon church when I was growing up. Every Mormon is a missionary.
Yeah. Yeah. And that I definitely remember my friends growing up felt that way. Because
Ye-
I think I want to say this was third or fourth grade, and it was a sleepover party for one of my friends. And I think they had the entire class over, and it
Wow.
was boys and girls. So, like, the girls were in one room, the boys were in another, but we all were taken to church and picked up after church. So, that's like my first memory of being in a different type of religious setting. It was similar, but community wise, very different.
Right. Uh, there is some Mormon obligation every night of the week. It's not a weekend religion.
Right.
Uh, Monday nights are family home evenings where you have a church doctrine family lesson, and it is reserved. So there are no other activities planned for Monday night. That is family night. And not to do something fun and bond as a family, but to be educated in a very specific way about the church and our responsibilities as members. And then Tuesday was primary. This was for the young people where they would learn more about the church and more about the best path to heaven.
Mhm.
And Wednesday night was for the teenagers, and they had teenage socials on the weekends and service projects on the weekends. And Thursday night were the boys. Mormons were really big on the Boy Scout program, and almost all boys were expected to become Eagle Scouts to prepare them for their missions that they would go on when they turned 18, which was just expected to
Yep.
devote 2 years of their lives to doing missionary work that they funded themselves.
Oh,
Uh,
wow. I didn't realize that the kids funded themselves.
well, kids were it, the, we were
Or I
all
mean, the
encouraged,
18-year-olds.
the 18-year-olds were encouraged to save their money from their paper routes and everything else to
Right.
go on a
Okay.
mission. But the deficit was made up by the family. Only
Okay.
in extreme cases of poverty did the church help out if a young man or woman wanted to go on a mission.
Okay. I was thinking it was everybody was funded through the church, because the other thing I remember was my friends talking about giving their tithe over to the church. Like, someone had like $400 in a savings account and had to give $40 to the church. And we were elementary, middle school, maybe. And that just shocked me because, one, I didn't have $400 in a savings account. And two, my parents were the only ones expected to support
Hi.
our church. And Lutherans don't tithe. I mean, we encourage it, but we don't have any mechanism for ensuring that people do. We would never ask someone to turn over your tax records. Like, that would be like an invasion of privacy that would lose us members.
Well, Mormons are expected to tithe 10% off the top. That's not,
Yeah.
and in order to enter the temples where the most sacred rituals and ceremonies take place, you have to be a full tithing member of the church. And you bring your tax returns to prove it when you go for your interview to get a temple recommend, which is a physical ID card with your photo on it, because no one is allowed in the Mormon church, Mormon temple, without this recommend. So tithing is really part of the business of being a Mormon, and not something that is taken lightly. And it's fairly controversial because the Washington Post shared that the Mormon church, quite recently, a whistleblower came forward and revealed that the Mormon church was using this money which was invested in a $100 billion private equity fund. This is the tithing that has been collected throughout the world.
100 billion with a B.
100 billion, second largest private equity fund in the world. And it was shocking to Wall Street. But what was
Yeah.
even more shocking and disappointing is that this whistleblower said the money was not being used as for charitable organizations or to help out in disaster situations or to affect good causes, but was held in reserve and was also being used to prop up Mormon businesses that were in trouble or
Wow.
rescue Mormon business ventures. I don't think people fully understand how wealthy the Mormon church is. It's the second wealthiest Christian religion in the world after the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and the Catholic Church has been around centuries to collect that wealth. I mean, you just look at the history of the Roman Catholic Church through Western Civ, and you can see what they ended up accumulating. But that is
Well,
incredible because Mormonism is 200 years old, if I'm correct,
yeah,
somewhere around there.
right.
Wow.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. And the largest landholder in the United States as well, private landholder in the United States. They're they're
So they
very
own more land. Okay, you said private, so not public, which would be the government. But
right.
they privately own more land than any other organization. Wow.
Uh-huh. And of course, there's no transparency because it's a religion
Yes, it's
or
not subject.
accountability.
Yep.
Mhm.
I mean, there are, so like our books at a local church level are audited each year, and um our national church audits things, but I don't know if it has to do that. It's a practice we do to kind of make sure no one's embezzling,
Right.
and to kind of make sure we're on the up and up. But I don't know if that's federally regulated or not. Um,
Right.
it's not, yeah. And if you're in a system like Utah where almost everybody's Mormon, you
Correct.
can
The people
you can
making the laws
laws, yeah, can favor the church.
and
Yeah,
investigating the church, even journalists,
yep,
politicians. You can't be in business in Utah without being a Mormon. I
yeah,
mean, we make jokes about it, but it's brother so and so. And if it's not brother so and so, then you're immediately out of the loop and
yep.
suspect. Whereas the secret handshake, brother so and so immediately gains you access to the inner circle.
Yeah. When you talk about the tithing thing, it triggered a memory. So my best friend got married at 18, age 18.
Yeah.
And I went down to the reception because none of us were allowed in the temple for her marriage. Her parents weren't even allowed because she told me they didn't have the temple points.
Right.
But they must
They had
not have
not
had.
passed their worthiness interview for whatever reason.
Yeah, and it surprised me because I couldn't imagine not having my parents at a wedding. It was just like such a shock. But she said the ceremony was so quick that they had like 45 minutes to kill before the reception started. And it just was so foreign to me that you
Yeah.
would be barred.
Well, the interesting thing, I didn't go to my brothers and sisters' Mormon weddings because they were in the temple, and they didn't quite understand why I was so hurt by being excluded.
Mm,
They said to me, "Well, it's a Mormon wedding. Why would you want to go since you're not a Mormon?" And I'm like, "Well, most weddings are inclusive affairs. And
yeah,
aren't I not part of the family?" But that tells you about some of the subtleties of estrangement. I
yes.
no longer, when I left the church at 19, I no longer had a role or a place in my family. And the traditions, family traditions, were so wrapped up in church tradition and
Yep.
church rituals and ceremonies that it was huge. Funeral,
Yeah.
weddings, everything what revolved around the Mormon faith.
So
So,
you left in the 1970s, correct?
correct.
And
I
can you talk about how you managed? Because that's before social media, it's before the internet, it's when long distance phone calls charged an arm and a leg. There was no unlimited phone calls. It really was, and then I think the mail took like a week if you were going to write a letter, but that was one of your cheapest options of communication. I mean, I think for people now to really step back into the shoes of the 1970s, like I have a 13-year-old and he's amazed that I can tie knots. And I told him, because I grew up late 70s, early 80s, or through the 80s. And I told him there was nothing else to do. Like you would get a book from the library and you would just tie knots because there was nothing else to do. You couldn't, the TV shows, there were 3 channels.
right.
So what were you going to do? But
It's
can you talk
true.
about that?
Well, I had no intention of leaving the Mormon church, but I graduated. I kind of, when my sister got kicked out of the house at 17, I really doubled down on my Mormon faith and trying
Okay.
to live up to the performance standards of my family and my heritage. We were held up in the community. I mean, we were considered Mormon royalty. I mean,
Yeah.
this is an example to follow. This family is an example to follow. And so anything that wasn't being the best, standing out, being special was unacceptable. The standards of perfectionism were extreme, but they felt normal to me. That's all I
Okay.
knew. But I graduated a year early from high school and I was too late to enroll at BYU, which is the Mormon
Yep.
University in Utah. And so I just went to Utah State University planning to transfer after my first year. And when I was at when I was there, I had a professor uh who challenged me to he found out I was a Mormon and he was an atheist, and he challenged me to take his the Bible as literature
Hmm.
class
Hmm.
next semester. Well, I adored this professor. He was my creative writing instructor. And I set out to read everything I could about the Mormon church and my famous relatives before taking his class, including books that had been forbidden by the church for me to read.
Yeah. Was one of them the God Makers?
No, it
Okay, that
was,
would have been later than maybe.
I think, I think so, but the book, and it's still one of the definitive biographies of Joseph Smith, is called No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brody.
Okay.
And it really not only opened my eyes, but shattered my world, because
Wow.
she took Joseph Smith and his family, my family, and put it in the context of what was happening in the social and religious milieu or of the time. And I realized for the first time, this is how the Mormon church got started.
Hmm.
There were a lot of churches, little offshoots. It was a time of great religious ferment. And Joseph Smith, some of his stories, I could suddenly see in context the origin of his unbelievable claims. Like he was arrested for defrauding his neighbors because he claimed he could find buried treasure. Well, it's only a couple of steps further to claim that you found gold plates in
Right.
the hills near your farm, and that these plates were, in fact, the record written by the ancestors to the Native Americans of a great civilization that lived on the North and South American continent before the Native Americans. And I I, I suddenly, and she documented everything with newspaper articles and first person accounts and signed affidavits, and all of a sudden I was I was devastated because it made so much sense.
Yeah.
I think I had spent a week holed up in the library just reading. And the last straw was when I learned that Joseph Smith's secret special temple ceremonies and rituals, which he claimed to be restored from King Solomon's temple, were in fact absolute copies of the Masonic rituals. Joseph
Yeah.
Smith had become a Mason, and he just literally copied a lot of the Mason rituals for his temple ceremonies. And I realized in that moment that I wasn't choosing not to believe. I just didn't believe. I
Yeah.
couldn't unsee what I had seen.
Yeah.
And I just honestly didn't know what to do with the information. I mean, I had been set apart and special my whole life because of who I was,
Right.
my Mormon identity, but also my family connection to Joseph Smith. And so I I didn't tell my parents right away, but I stopped going to church and Mormon socials and the education program they had for college students, uh, which was continuing education. And the church came looking for me. They sent the visiting teachers to come check on me. And these sisters, as they introduced themselves, wanted to know why I hadn't been at church. And I decided to tell the truth and said I didn't believe anymore. And they were stunned. They knew who I was.
Right.
And they alternately begged me to reconsider, said I'd been led astray by Satan, and threatened me with, um, you know, becoming uh, a daughter of perdition, meaning I'd be in outer darkness forever for denying the truth of the church. And so I had to then very quickly tell my parents before the church told them.
Yeah. How was that? How did that go?
Painful.
Yeah.
Um, my mother was devastated. She couldn't believe it. I think I was the last person in the family she expected to stray.
Hmm.
And she was heartbroken, and she basically handled it by asking me to reconsider. She told me I was destroying the family's chances of being all together in heaven, and that I needed to pray about it again and listen to God's promptings. And I think denial worked for her. She remained in denial forever with me,
Hmm.
thinking that one day I would come back. My father and I were very close. He was extremely proud of me after my sister was dismissed from the household. I became his favorite because I was an achiever.
Right.
And he now had a problem on his hands because he had been my advocate, had put me on a pedestal in the family,
Right.
saying to my younger brothers and sisters, this is what happens when you follow God's commandments and do your best and work hard. And suddenly I was saying something uh, that was completely out of line. So he didn't kick me out of the household, but he basically said, uh, there may be some things about the church that are, as he put it, unsavory, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
And I did, in fact, when I decided that the Mormon church was a fraud, I decided, as only a 19-year-old could, that maybe the whole idea of God was a myth, and I became an atheist. I
Mhm.
mean, so talk about a 360 or 180 or whatever you want to call it. And that left me completely unmoored.
Yeah.
I did not know. I felt so alone and so isolated and so unsure about what was real. What was the point of this whole living on the planet? I mean,
Right.
was there a reason for being here? Were there any rules? Did any of it matter? So it took me to a really dark place. I was trying, I knew I had to leave Utah. So when I graduated from college, I never went to BYU.
Mhm.
Um, I I left for New York City, sight unseen.
Thank you for listening to the first of 3 podcasts with Lyn Smith Gregory. In our next episode, Lyn will talk about her move to New York City and how she began to deconstruct her faith and rebuild relationships. If you would like to share your story or have useful tips for healing from religious trauma, feel free to reach out to me or Ray at Condemned Happy. That's CONDEMNEDHAPPY @gmail.com. Resources that Lyn has found helpful are available on the show notes and on our blogs. Have a great week.